The train lurched to a stop with a metal shriek that made Clara's teeth ache. 3 days. 3 exhausting, filthy days crammed into a wooden bench surrounded by families and drifters and men who smelled like they hadn't bathed since Independence Day. Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the scratched window and stared out at what was supposed to be her future. Wyoming Territory looked like the end of the earth. A single dirt platform stood beside the tracks. Behind it, maybe a dozen weather-beaten buildings slouched against each other like drunks holding each other upright. Mountains rose in the distance, blue-gray and hostile under a sky so big it made her dizzy. The wind howled across the empty land, kicking up dust devils that spun and died in the scrub grass. Clara's hands shook as she gathered her carpet bag and stepped down onto the platform. The September air hit her like a slap, dry and cold and nothing like the damp autumn back in Pennsylvania. She smoothed her traveling dress, trying to look dignified even though she felt like she might vomit. 22 years old, alone, 2,000 miles from home, and no one waiting for her. She scanned the handful of people scattered across the platform. A family with 3 children hurried toward a wagon. 2 ranch hands argued over a crate of supplies. An older woman in a black dress glared at Clara like she'd crawled out from under a rock. But no tall rancher named Thomas Garrett. No man holding flowers or a sign with her name. No one looking for a mail-order bride who'd just spent her last bit of savings to get here. Clara swallowed hard and moved to the edge of the platform, trying to stay out of the way. The conductor called out something about freight, and the train hissed steam like it was already bored with this place. Within minutes, most of the passengers had scattered. The family climbed into their wagon and disappeared down the road. The ranch hands loaded their crate onto a mule and trudged off toward the mountains. The platform emptied. Clara stood alone with her carpet bag at her feet and a letter crumpled in her hand. Dear Miss Whitmore, I am a landowner in Wyoming Territory seeking a wife of good character. I have a homestead, livestock, and prospects for a stable future. If you are willing to travel west, I will provide for you and treat you with respect. Please arrive in Bitter Creek on September 14th. I will be waiting. Yours truly, Thomas Garrett. She'd read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. She'd imagined a dozen versions of the man who wrote it. A kind rancher with calloused hands and a shy smile. A lonely widower looking for companionship. Maybe even a handsome cowboy who'd see her and realize he'd made the right choice. But mostly, she'd imagined not being unwanted anymore. Back in Pennsylvania, Clara had worked in a boarding house for 3 years after her parents died. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals, changed linens, and listened to women whisper about her behind her back. Poor thing. No family, no prospects, getting older by the day. When the boarding house owner's nephew started pressuring her to marry him, a man twice her age who drank too much and had hands that wandered, she'd known she had to leave. Thomas Garrett's letter had arrived like a miracle. A chance at a new life. A place where no one knew she was the orphan girl with no dowry and no future. So she'd sold everything she owned, bought a train ticket, and prayed she wasn't making the worst mistake of her life. Now, standing on this desolate platform, as the sun sank lower and the wind bit through her thin coat, Clara was starting to think prayer didn't count for much out here. You waiting for someone? Clara turned. The older woman in the black dress stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes hard. Up close, she looked like she'd been carved out of the same stone as the mountains, all sharp angles and no softness. Yes, Clara said, lifting her chin. I'm meeting someone. Who? A rancher, Thomas Garrett. The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or contempt. Clara couldn't tell which was worse. Garrett's place is 20 miles north, the woman said flatly. He ain't coming. Clara's stomach twisted. What do you mean? I mean, he ain't the type to ride into town for a woman, especially not one he don't know. The woman looked Clara up and down, taking in her city dress and clean hands. You one of those mail-order girls? The words hit like a punch. Clara felt her face burn. I'm his fiancée. Sure you are. The woman snorted. You got money for a room? Clara hesitated. She had $3 left. Maybe 4 if she counted the coins at the bottom of her bag. I'll be fine. No, you won't. The woman shook her head. There's one boarding house in town, and Mrs. Halford don't take in single women without references. You'll be sleeping in the livery stable if you're lucky. If you're smart, you'll get back on that train tomorrow and go home. I don't have a home. The words came out harder than Clara intended. The woman stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Clara stood there as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky orange and red like the whole territory was on fire. The train huffed and rumbled behind her, preparing to pull out. For one wild second, she thought about climbing back on. About admitting this whole thing had been a mistake, and going back to Pennsylvania defeated. But going back to what? The boarding house? The nephew with the wandering hands? A life of scrubbing other people's floors until she was too old to stand? No. Clara picked up her bag and walked toward the cluster of buildings that passed for a town. Bitter Creek wasn't much. A general store with a sagging porch, a saloon with broken windows and loud voices spilling out into the street, a livery stable that smelled like manure and wet hay, and at the far end of the street, a narrow two-story house with a painted sign that read Halford's Rooms. Clara walked up the steps and knocked. The woman who opened the door was short, round, and looked at Clara the way you'd look at a stray dog on your porch. "Help you?" "I need a room," Clara said. "Just for tonight." "You got references?" "No, but I can pay." Mrs. Halford's eyes narrowed. "You traveling alone?" "I'm meeting someone." "Who?" Clara hesitated. She was so tired of that question. "Thomas Garrett." Mrs. Halford's expression hardened. "Garrett didn't tell me he was bringing anyone in." It was arranged, through letters." Understanding dawned on the woman's face, followed immediately by disapproval. "You're one of those brides." Clara forced herself to stand straighter. "I'm his fiancée." "Does he know that?" The question landed like a stone in Clara's chest. "Of course he does. He sent for me." Mrs. Halford looked her over, lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't rent to women without proper introductions. Causes talk. And I don't need trouble." "I'm not trouble. I just need a place to sleep." "Then you should have made sure your man was here to vouch for you." Mrs. Halford started to close the door. "Try the livery." "Wait, please. I have money." But the door shut in her face. Clara stood on the porch, shaking, not from cold, from rage, from humiliation, from the creeping realization that she'd made a catastrophic mistake and there was no way to undo it. Behind her, the street was emptying. Men disappeared into the saloon. Lights flickered on in windows. Somewhere, a dog barked. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and dust and something wild she couldn't name. She was alone. Clara walked back toward the train depot, but the train was already gone. The platform stood empty under the darkening sky. She sat down on a bench, her bag at her feet, and tried to think. $3 wouldn't get her back to Pennsylvania. It wouldn't even get her to the next town. She could sleep outside tonight, maybe find work in the morning. But doing what? She'd seen the way the women here looked at her, like she was a threat, like she was diseased. And what if Thomas Garrett really wasn't coming? The thought made her throat tighten. She'd been so sure, so certain that this was her chance, that someone, somewhere, wanted her. She'd been wrong before. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and stared out at the mountains disappearing into shadow. She'd never felt so small, so stupid, so completely, utterly alone. That's when she heard the horse. Hoofbeats slow and steady, coming from the north. Clara looked up and saw a rider emerge from the twilight, a man on a dark horse, moving through the dim light like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. He rode into the depot and dismounted in one smooth motion. Dust covered his coat. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved like someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than on his feet. Clara stood up, heart hammering. Maybe this was him. Maybe Thomas Garrett had finally come. The man tied his horse to the post and turned toward her. For the first time, she got a good look at his face. Not handsome. Not in any soft or gentle way. His jaw was hard, his skin weathered by sun and wind. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his temple, but his eyes, dark and sharp, held something that made Clara's breath catch. Guilt. He stopped a few feet away, studying her like she was a problem he didn't know how to solve. "You Clara Whitmore?" His voice was rough, low, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "Yes." Clara's hands tightened on her bag. "Are you Thomas Garrett?" "No." The single word crushed the last bit of hope she'd been clinging to. "Then who are you?" "Rhett Mercer." He glanced at her bag, then back at her face. "Garrett sent me." Clara's vision blurred at the edges. She felt like she might faint, or scream, or both. "Where is he?" "His place, 20 miles north." "Why didn't he come himself?" Rhett Mercer's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. "He's sick." "Sick?" Been laid up for a week. Fever. He asked me to ride down and meet you. Clara stared at him. Something about this didn't add up. If he's been sick for a week, why didn't he send word? Why did he let me travel all this way without telling me? Rhett's expression didn't change, but she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. Because he didn't want you to come. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Clara felt her legs go weak. She sat down hard on the bench, the carpet bag slipping from her hands. He changed his mind. Yeah. Then why send you? Because I told him he owed you more than leaving you stranded. Rhett pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. He looked exhausted. Look, I know this ain't what you were expecting. I got money for a train ticket back east. Garrett's paying. You can leave tomorrow morning. Clara didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at the platform beneath her feet, at the dust and the dirt and the evidence of every stupid choice she'd ever made. Miss Whitmore? She looked up at him, this stranger, this man who'd ridden into town to deliver the worst news of her life with the efficiency of a death notice. I'm not going back. Rhett frowned. There's nothing for you here. There's nothing for me anywhere. Clara stood up, her voice shaking. I sold everything I owned to come here. I spent every dollar I had. I don't have family. I don't have a home. And I'm not going back to Pennsylvania so people can laugh at the stupid girl who thought someone actually wanted her. That's not... Where's the homestead? Rhett blinked. What? Thomas Garrett's homestead. Where is it? 20 miles north, up in the valley. Then that's where I'm going. No, you're not. Clara grabbed her bag and started walking toward his horse. You can take me, or I'll find my own way. But I'm going. Rhett moved fast. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Up close, he was even bigger than she'd thought. Intimidating. But Clara was done being scared. Get out of my way. You can't ride up there alone, Rhett said. It's rough country, cold at night, and Garrett doesn't want you. I don't care what he wants. Clara's voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. He promised me a life, a future. He lied. But the land is real, isn't it? The homestead is real? Yeah, but then it's mine as much as his. I came here for it, and I'm not leaving. Rhett stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But standing here in this godforsaken town with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Clara felt something sharp and fierce rise up inside her. She'd spent her whole life being unwanted, being discarded, being told she wasn't good enough. Not anymore. You gonna help me or not? Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, low and tired, and shook his head. You're making a mistake. Probably. Clara lifted her chin. But it's my mistake to make. He studied her face, and she saw the exact moment he gave up trying to talk sense into her. Fine. He walked over to his horse and started checking the saddle. But we're not leaving tonight. It's too dark and the trail's too dangerous. We'll go at first light. Where am I supposed to sleep? Livery Stable's got a loft. He didn't look at her. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand better, but she'd already pushed as far as she could tonight. Thank you. Rhett glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. Like he hadn't expected her to be polite, like he'd thought she'd be hysterical or helpless or both. Don't thank me yet, he said quietly. You ain't seen the place, Wong. The livery stable smelled like hay and horse sweat and old leather. The owner, a man with no teeth and suspicious eyes, took Clara's last dollar and pointed her toward a ladder leading to the loft. She climbed up and found a space barely big enough to lie down. Hay bales lined the walls. A thin horse blanket lay folded in the corner. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, she could see the street below, dark except for the glow from the saloon. Clara sat down on this blanket and finally let herself cry. Not loud. Not the kind of sobbing that would bring people running. Just quiet, exhausted tears that soaked into her dirty gloves as she pressed her hands against her face. She'd been so stupid, so desperate, and now she was trapped. Below, she heard Rhett Mercer talking to the stable owner. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't ask for trouble but wouldn't back down from it either. She wondered what kind of man rode 20 miles just to tell a stranger her life was ruined. What kind of man argued with a rancher on behalf of a woman he'd never met? She wondered what kind of man she was about to follow into the wilderness. Clara wiped her eyes and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the horses shifted and stamped in their stalls. And somewhere far above, the stars came out over Wyoming territory, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the foolish girl who'd gambled everything and lost. But she hadn't lost yet. Not completely. because tomorrow she'd ride into those mountains. She'd see the homestead that was supposed to be her future, and she'd figure out how to survive in a place that clearly didn't want her. Clara Whitmore had spent 22 years being unwanted. She was done with that, even if it killed her. Numbed. Dawn came cold and gray. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and boots on wooden planks below. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard floor. Her dress was wrinkled and dusty. She had no mirror, no water to wash with, no way to make herself presentable. She climbed down the ladder and found Rhett already awake, saddling his horse. He glanced at her, took in her appearance without comment, and handed her a canteen. "Drink. It's a long ride." Clara drank. The water was cold and tasted faintly of metal, but it helped clear the fog from her head. "You got anything warmer than that?" Rhett nodded toward her thin coat. "No." He frowned, then pulled a rolled blanket from his saddle and handed it to her. "Wrap this around your shoulders. Mountains get cold." "I can't take your blanket." "You just did." He turned back to the horse. "We leave in 5 minutes. If you need to eat, there's bread in the saddlebag. If you need to handle anything personal, now's the time." Clara's face burned, but she didn't argue. She stepped behind the stable, took care of necessities, and came back to find Rhett waiting beside the horse. He mounted first, then reached down. "Give me your hand." Clara hesitated. She'd never ridden a horse before, never been this close to one. "Miss Whitmore, we don't have time for nerves." She grabbed his hand. His grip was iron. He pulled her up behind him like she weighed nothing, and suddenly she was perched on the back of the saddle, her arms instinctively wrapping around his waist to keep from falling. "Hold tight," Rhett said, "and don't let go." Then he kicked the horse into motion, and Bitter Creek disappeared behind them. The land opened up like a wound. At first it was just empty, flat scrubland dotted with sagebrush and rocks. But as they rode north, the terrain changed. Hills rose on either side. The ground grew rougher, and the mountains, those massive blue-gray peaks that had looked distant from town, suddenly loomed over them like walls. Clara had never seen anything so big, so indifferent. Back east, the land felt tamed, controlled. Farmland and fences and roads that made sense. This place didn't care if you lived or died. They rode for hours without speaking. Rhett kept the horse at a steady pace, navigating trails Clara couldn't even see. She clung to his back, her fingers numb from the cold, her legs aching from the awkward position. Around mid-morning, they stopped beside a narrow stream. Rhett dismounted and helped her down. Clara's legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. "Walk around," Rhett said. "Get the blood moving." She did, wincing with every step. Rhett led the horse to the stream to drink, then crouched beside the water and splashed his face. "How much farther?" Clara asked. 6, maybe 7 hours. Her stomach sank. "That long?" "Garrett's place is isolated. That's the point." Rhett straightened and looked at her. "You still got time to change your mind. I can take you back." "No." "You don't know what you're walking into." "And you do?" Rhett's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I do." Clara crossed her arms. "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, hard. "Thomas Garrett is a coward. He's been out here 2 years, and he's barely holding on. The land's too rough. The cabin's falling apart. He's got debts he can't pay and neighbors who don't trust him. He thought bringing in a wife would fix things, make him look respectable. But when it came time to actually face you, he couldn't do it." "Why not?" "Because he knew you'd see the truth." Rhett turned to her. "He didn't send for a partner. He sent for someone desperate enough not to ask questions." The words landed like punches. Clara felt her face burn. "You think I don't know that?" Her voice shook. "You think I don't know I'm desperate? I spent 3 days on a train with people staring at me like I was pathetic. I stood on that platform knowing no one was coming. I'm not stupid, Mr. Mercer. I'm just out of options." Rhett looked at her, and for the first time she saw something besides guilt in his eyes. Respect. "All right," he said quietly. "But when we get there, don't expect anything good." They rode on. The sun climbed higher, but the air stayed cold. Wind whipped down from the mountains, carrying the smell of pine and snow. Clara saw things she'd never seen before. Elk grazing in distant meadows, hawks circling overhead, rock formations that looked like giants frozen mid-step. It was beautiful and terrifying. By late afternoon, they entered a valley carved between 2 massive ridges. The trail narrowed. Trees pressed in on both sides, tall pines that blocked out the sun and turned the world into shadow. Clara heard water running somewhere nearby, fast and wild. "Almost there," Rhett said. 10 minutes later, they broke through the trees into a clearing. Clara's breath caught. The homestead sat in the middle of the valley like something out of a nightmare. A single-room cabin with a sagging roof and gaps between the logs where the chinking had fallen out. The porch leaned to one side. 2 broken windows were covered with oiled paper. Behind the cabin, a barn that looked ready to collapse. Fences that had rotted and fallen. And beyond that, scrubland stretching toward the base of the mountains, barren except for dead grass and rocks. This was the future Thomas Garrett had promised her. Rhett dismounted and helped her down. Clara stood in the clearing, staring at the ruin in front of her. "Where is he?" she asked. "Inside." Clara walked toward the cabin on legs that felt like wood. The door was closed. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. "Mr. Garrett?" Still nothing. Rhett stepped past her and shoved the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a dim interior that smelled like sweat and smoke and sickness. A man lay on a cot against the far wall. Thin, pale, covered in blankets despite the warmth from the stove. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. This was Thomas Garrett, the man who'd written those letters, the man who'd promised her a life. He looked half dead already. "Garrett," Rhett's voice cut through the silence. "She's here." The man's eyes opened. He looked at Rhett, then past him toward Clara standing in the doorway. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas Garrett's face twisted into something ugly. Fear, resentment, maybe even hate. "Get her out of here," he rasped. Clara stepped inside. "You sent for me. I changed my mind." "Too late." Her voice was steady now, calm. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Garrett tried to sit up, but he was too weak. He collapsed back onto the cot, breathing hard. "You can't stay. This place, it's not... It's exactly what you promised." Clara looked around the filthy cabin, at the broken furniture and dirt floor and empty shelves. A homestead, land, a future. "There's no future here." Garrett's voice cracked. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. The land's worthless. The cabin's falling apart. I'm selling it and going back east." "Then sell it to me." Both men stared at her. Clara set her bag down and met Garrett's eyes. "I came here for this place. You owe me that much. You got no money. I'll work. I'll fix it. I'll make it worth something." She stepped closer. "But I'm not going back empty-handed." Garrett laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. "You're insane." "Probably." Clara didn't flinch. "But I'm also here, and you're not getting rid of me." Rhett watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Garrett looked at her for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and turned his face toward the wall. "Do whatever you want," he muttered. "I don't care anymore." Clara stood in the middle of the cabin, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, every instinct screaming that she'd just made a terrible mistake. But she'd also just claimed something that was hers, for better or worse. And she wasn't surrendering it to anyone. The silence after Garrett's words felt like something physical. Clara stood in the middle of that wrecked cabin, breathing hard, waiting for someone to tell her she'd won or lost or something in between. But Rhett just stared at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and Garrett kept his face turned to the wall like a child refusing to acknowledge reality. Fine. If no one else was going to move, she would. Clara walked over to the stove. It was iron, old, covered in rust and grease. A few pieces of wood sat in a bucket beside it, along with what looked like the remains of someone's failed attempt at cooking. She opened the stove door and saw embers barely clinging to life. "When's the last time anyone fed this fire?" she asked. Neither man answered. Clara grabbed 2 pieces of wood and shoved them into the stove, then used a poker hanging on the wall to stir the coals. Smoke billowed up, making her eyes water, but after a moment the wood caught. Heat began spreading through the tiny space. She turned back to Garrett. "When did you eat last?" "Don't know." His voice was muffled against the wall. "Don't care." "You should. You're half dead already." Good. Clara felt anger flare hot in her chest. This man had pulled her across the country with promises he never intended to keep, and now he was lying here feeling sorry for himself while his cabin rotted around him. "Where's your food?" Garrett didn't answer. Rhett pointed toward a shelf in the corner. Clara walked over and found a sack of flour, some beans, a tin of lard, and not much else. Everything was covered in dust and mouse droppings. She took the flour and beans outside to the porch, shook them out, and checked for weevils. The flour was mostly salvageable. The beans needed sorting. She brought them back inside and set them on the table, a rickety thing with one leg shorter than the others. "You got a pot?" she asked Rhett. He hesitated, then walked over to a shelf and pulled down a dented pot with a broken handle. Clara took it without comment, filled it with water from a bucket by the door, and set it on the stove to boil. "What are you doing?" Rhett asked. "Making something edible." Clara dumped beans into the pot. "Unless you've got a better plan." Rhett watched her for a moment, then shook his head and walked outside. Clara worked in the dim cabin, listening to Garrett's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. Her hand shook as she measured flour and mixed it with water and lard to make a rough dough. She'd learned to cook in the boarding house back in Pennsylvania, simple, cheap meals that stretched ingredients as far as they'd go. This wasn't much different. The beans took forever to soften. While they cooked, Clara explored the cabin. One room, maybe 15 feet across. The cot where Garrett lay. A table and 2 chairs. Shelves lined with junk, rusted tools, empty bottles, a broken clock. The floor was dirt, packed hard and covered in tracked-in mud, and what looked like animal droppings. No curtains. No rugs. No sign that anyone had tried to make this place livable. Clara found a broom in the corner, half the bristles missing, and started sweeping. Dirt and debris piled up fast. She swept it all toward the door, then outside onto the porch. Garrett made a noise of protest, but she ignored him. By the time Rhett came back inside, the cabin was marginally cleaner, the beans were edible, and Clara had rolled out flat cakes of dough to fry in the lard. Rhett stopped in the doorway, looking around like he'd walked into the wrong place. "It's just dirt," Clara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I didn't perform miracles." "Could have fooled me." Rhett took off his hat and hung it on a nail by the door. "You always this stubborn?" "I prefer determined." "That's what stubborn people call it." But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite criticism, maybe respect or exhaustion. Clara dished beans and fried bread onto 2 tin plates and handed one to Rhett. He stared at it. "You made this out of his supplies?" "They were going to waste anyway." "He might not see it that way." "Then he can complain when he's strong enough to stand." Clara took her own plate and sat down at the table. The chair wobbled, but it held. "You should eat before it gets cold." Rhett sat across from her. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. The food wasn't good. The beans were bland and the bread was heavy. But it was hot, and it filled the empty space in Clara's stomach that had been there since yesterday. Across the room, Garrett shifted on the cot. "I don't want anything." "Didn't ask what you wanted," Clara said without looking at him. "You need to eat or you'll die. I didn't come all this way to bury you." "Maybe you should have stayed in Pennsylvania." Clara set down her fork. The sound echoed in the quiet cabin. She stood, walked over to the cot, and looked down at Thomas Garrett. Up close, he looked even worse. His skin was gray, his eyes sunken. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He smelled like sickness and fear. "You wrote me letters," Clara said quietly. "You told me you had a future here, that you wanted a wife, that you'd treat me with respect." She crouched down so they were eye to eye. "I believed you. I sold everything I owned. I spent 3 days on a train with people who looked at me like I was pathetic. I waited on that platform until dark, wondering if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. And when your friend finally showed up to tell me you'd changed your mind, I still came here. You know why?" Garrett said nothing. "Because I'm done being unwanted, done being thrown away. So you can lie there and feel sorry for yourself all you want, but I'm not leaving. This place is mine now. And if you've got a problem with that, you can get up and do something about it." Garrett stared at her with bloodshot eyes. Then, slowly, he turned his face back to the wall. Clara stood and walked back to the table. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. From anger. From something wild and fierce she'd been holding back for years. Rhett was watching her. "You always talk to dying men like that?" "Only the ones who deserve it." He almost smiled. Almost. "Fair enough." They finished eating in silence. When Clara collected the plates, Rhett stopped her. "I'll handle those. You should rest." "I'm fine." "You rode all day. You haven't slept in a real bed since Pennsylvania, and you're about to collapse." His voice was firm. "Sit down." Clara wanted to argue, but her legs were trembling and her head felt light. She sat. Rhett took the plates outside. Clara heard water splashing, the sound of scrubbing. When he came back, the plates were clean and he was carrying an armful of wood. Fire'll die if we don't keep feeding it, he said, stacking wood beside the stove. Gets cold up here at night. Where are you going to sleep? Clara asked. Barn. There's a loft. He straightened and looked around the cabin. You can have the floor in here. I'll bring in some blankets. What about him? Clara nodded toward Garrett. He's got the cot. That's more than he deserves. Rhett left and returned a few minutes later with 2 wool blankets that smelled like horses and dust. He handed them to Clara, then stood awkwardly near the door like he wasn't sure what to say. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me. You're the one who decided to stay in this mess. Still, you didn't have to help. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Yeah, I did. Before Clara could ask what he meant, he was gone. She spread one blanket on the floor near the stove and wrapped the other around her shoulders. The floor was hard and cold, even with the fire burning, but it was better than the livery stable, better than a train bench, better than nothing. Clara lay down and stared at the ceiling. Cracks ran through the wooden beams, gaps let in cold air. Somewhere outside, an animal howled, wolf or coyote, she couldn't tell. This was her life now. A broken cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wilderness that wanted her dead, with a man who hated her lying 10 feet away and another man sleeping in a barn because there was nowhere else to go. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. The next morning, Clara woke to voices. She sat up fast, disoriented, her body aching from the hard floor. Pale light filtered through the gaps in the walls. The fire had burned down to coals, and 2 men were arguing outside. Clara stood, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. Rhett stood near the barn, arms crossed, facing a man on horseback. The stranger was older, maybe 50, with a thick beard and a rifle slung across his saddle. He looked angry. I don't care what Garrett told you, the man was saying. That fence line's been disputed for 2 years, and I'm not waiting anymore. If you can't work the land, it reverts. That's not how land claims work, Dalton. It is when the claimant's too sick to defend it. The man, Dalton, spotted Clara on the porch. His eyes narrowed. Who's that? None of your business. Like hell it's not. If Garrett brought in help, that changes things. Rhett stepped forward, his voice dropping into something dangerous. Ride back to your place, Dalton, before this gets ugly. Dalton stared at him, jaw tight. Then he spat into the dirt and turned his horse. Tell Garrett I'll be back, and next time I'm bringing my sons. He rode off, disappearing into the trees. Rhett stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Then he turned and saw Clara watching. You hear all that? Most of it. Who is he? Neighbor? Got a spread about 5 miles west. Rhett walked toward the cabin. He's been trying to take Garrett's land for months, claims the boundary's wrong. Is it? No, but out here, being right doesn't matter if you can't enforce it. Rhett climbed the steps and looked at her. You still think this is a good idea? Clara pulled the blanket tighter. I don't have any other ideas. You could leave. I'll take you back to town, buy you a train ticket. And go where? Back to Pennsylvania so I can scrub floors for the rest of my life? She shook her head. I'd rather take my chances here. Rhett studied her face. You're either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? This time he actually smiled. Small, brief, but real. Yeah, I guess it can. Inside the cabin, Garrett was awake. He'd managed to sit up, though he looked like it had cost him everything. His eyes followed Clara as she came inside. You should have left, he said hoarsely. Too late. Clara walked to the stove and started rebuilding the fire. Your neighbor was just here. Sounds like he's planning to take your land. Let him, I don't care. Well, I do. Clara fed kindling into the stove until flames caught. If I'm going to live here, I'm not sharing it with someone who thinks he can bully his way onto the property. You're not living here, you're... Garrett started coughing, harsh and wet. It went on for nearly a minute before he finally collapsed back onto the cot, gasping. Clara watched him, feeling something uncomfortably close to pity. When's the last time you saw a doctor? There's no doctor. Nearest one's in Rawlins, 40 miles south. Then you need medicine, something for the fever. I don't have money for medicine. Then you should have thought of that before you sent for a mail-order bride and wasted her train fare. Clara turned to Rhett, who was standing in the doorway. Is there a store in town? Somewhere that sells supplies? General store, but Garrett's right. Medicine costs money. I'll figure something out. Clara untied her bag and started digging through it. She didn't have much. A few pieces of clothing, a hairbrush, her mother's locket, but at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a silver ring, the only thing of value she'd kept. She held it up to the light. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. This should cover medicine and food, she said, if I can find someone to buy it. Rhett's expression darkened. That's all you've got left. Then I better make it count. Clara, don't. She cut him off. I'm not arguing about this. If I'm staying here, I need him alive. At least long enough to sign over the land claim. Garrett made a noise that might have been a laugh or a sob. You're insane. You already said that. Clara tucked the ring into her pocket. When can we leave for town? Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed, low and tired. Give me an hour to get the horse ready. They rode back to Bitter Creek in cold silence. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening rain or maybe snow. Clara sat behind Rhett again, clinging to his coat as the horse picked its way down the narrow trail. She tried not to think about what she was doing, selling her mother's ring, committing to a life in a place that clearly didn't want her, trusting a stranger to help her when she had no reason to believe anyone would. But thinking about it wouldn't change anything. So she focused on the wind biting her face and the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the fact that she was still moving forward. They reached town just before noon, the same dusty street, the same suspicious faces watching from windows and doorways. Clara ignored them all. Rhett led her to the general store, a narrow building with a faded sign and shelves crammed with everything from flour to ammunition. A woman stood behind the counter, thin and sharp-eyed, watching them enter like they might steal something. Help you? She asked. Need medicine, Rhett said. Fever treatment, willow bark if you've got it. The woman pulled a small bottle from a shelf. $2. Clara stepped forward and placed the ring on the counter. Will this cover it? The woman picked up the ring, examined it, held it to the light. Silver? Yes. Where'd you get it? It was my mother's. The woman's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. I'll give you $3 for it. Medicine and a credit for supplies. It wasn't enough, but it was more than Clara had expected. Deal. The woman handed over the bottle and made a note in a ledger. Credits good for flour, beans, lard, nothing fancy. That's fine. Clara took the medicine and followed Rhett back outside. The cold hit her like a slap, but she barely felt it. She'd just sold the last thing connecting her to her old life, the last piece of her mother, and she couldn't even feel sad about it. You all right? Rhett asked. Clara nodded. Let's go back. They rode in silence again. But this time, Clara didn't feel like crying. She felt empty, hollowed out, like she'd left some essential part of herself on that counter next to the ring, but she'd also gained something. Time. Back at the cabin, Garrett was exactly where they'd left him, lying on the cot, staring at nothing. Clara mixed the medicine with water and forced him to drink it. He fought her at first, weak and stubborn, but eventually swallowed. This won't fix anything, he muttered. No, but it might keep you alive long enough to matter. Clara set the cup aside. Now sleep. I've got work to do. She spent the rest of the day cleaning, not just sweeping, actually cleaning. She hauled buckets of water from the stream behind the cabin, scrubbed the floor until her hands were raw, washed the filthy blankets and hung them outside to dry. She sorted through the junk on the shelves, throwing out broken tools and empty bottles, organizing what was left. Rhett helped without being asked. He fixed the broken leg on the table, patched holes in the walls with mud and grass, replaced the oiled paper on the windows with actual glass he'd found in the barn. They worked side by side, not talking much, just moving through tasks with the efficiency of people who understood that survival required work, not words. By evening, the cabin looked almost livable. Not good, but better. Clara stood in the doorway as the sun set, looking at what they'd accomplished. Her body ached. Her hands were blistered. She smelled like sweat and smoke and hard work. She'd never felt more alive. You should eat, Rhett said behind her. Clara turned. He was standing near the stove, holding 2 plates of beans and bread. She hadn't even heard him cook. When did you make that? While you were drowning yourself in dirty water. He handed her a plate. Sit, before you fall over. They ate on the porch, watching the valley disappear into shadow. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Closer, an owl called. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like rushing water. Why are you helping me? Clara asked quietly. Rhett didn't answer right away. He stared out at the darkening mountains, his expression unreadable. Because someone should have helped me once, he he finally said, and no one did. Clara waited, but he didn't elaborate. She didn't push. They finished eating in silence. Then Rhett took the plates, cleaned them, and headed toward the barn without another word. Clara went inside and lay down on her blanket by the fire. Garrett was asleep, his breathing steadier than before. The medicine was working, maybe. Or maybe he was just too exhausted to fight anymore. She closed her eyes and listened to the cabin settle. Creaks and groans, wind rattling the walls, the fire crackling low. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to keep this place running, how to deal with neighbors who wanted the land, how to survive without money or help or any idea what she was doing. But tonight, she slept. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm Clara had never experienced before. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, make breakfast, work until dark, collapse onto her blanket and sleep like the dead. Rhett taught her things she'd never imagined needing to know. How to chop wood without hitting her own foot, how to haul water efficiently, how to tell the difference between animal tracks, deer, elk, wolf, bear, how to keep the fire going through the night, how to mend tools with wire and determination. She learned fast because she had to. Garrett improved slowly. The fever broke after 3 days, leaving him weak but conscious. He didn't thank Clara, didn't acknowledge what she and Rhett had done. He just lay on that cot, staring at the ceiling, radiating resentment. Clara stopped caring what he thought. On the 5th day, she woke to find Rhett already outside, working on the fence line near the barn. She pulled on her boots and joined him. "What are you doing?" "Fixing this before Dalton decides to test the boundary again." Rhett hammered a post into the ground. "He's been quiet. That's not a good sign." "You think he'll come back?" "I know he will." Rhett straightened and looked at her. "Men like Dalton don't back down. They wait until you're weak, then they push." "Then we don't show weakness." Rhett raised an eyebrow. "We?" Clara picked up a hammer. "You're still here, aren't you?" "For now." "Then we." They worked together, resetting posts and stretching wire. It was hard, brutal work. Clara's hands blistered, bled, then calloused. Her back screamed, her arms shook from exhaustion. But the fence got fixed. That night, sitting on the porch with plates of beans and stale bread, Rhett looked at her with something like curiosity. "You ever worked like this before?" "No." "Then how are you not dead?" Clara smiled, tired and grim. Spite. He actually laughed. A real laugh, low and rough. "That'll do it." Inside the cabin, Garrett heard them and turned his face to the wall. A week after Clara arrived, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Clara saw them first. She was hauling water from the stream when she spotted movement through the trees. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately. One of them was Dalton. She dropped the bucket and ran. "Rhett!" He was in the barn, fixing a broken stall door. He came out fast, saw the riders, and his expression went hard. "Get inside. Stay with Garrett." "What are you going to do?" "Talk." But his hand moved to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. "Now go." Clara didn't argue. She ran to the cabin and slammed the door behind her. Garrett was sitting up on the cot, pale but alert. "What's happening?" "Your neighbor's back, with friends." Garrett's face went even paler. "How many?" "3. He swore, low and vicious. "We can't fight 3 men." "Then let's hope Rhett can talk them down." Through the gaps in the walls, Clara watched Rhett walk toward the property line. The riders stopped just beyond the fence. Dalton sat in the middle, flanked by 2 younger men, his sons, probably. They looked like him. Hard faces, cold eyes. The conversation was too far away to hear clearly, but Clara caught pieces. Dalton's voice, loud and aggressive. Rhett's, low and steady. The sons laughing. Then Dalton pointed toward the cabin. Clara's stomach dropped. Rhett shook his head. Dalton pointed again, more insistent. One of the sons started to dismount. Rhett raised the rifle. The son froze. Dalton's face twisted with rage. He said something sharp, and all 3 men reached for their own weapons. Clara stopped thinking. She grabbed the shotgun hanging on the wall. She'd seen it there days ago and ignored it, and shoved the door open. She didn't know how to shoot, didn't know if the thing was even loaded, but she stepped onto the porch, raised the gun to her shoulder, and aimed it at the riders. Everyone froze. Dalton stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's tired of being threatened." Clara's voice shook, but she kept the gun steady. "This is private property. You're not welcome here." One of the sons laughed. "You even know how to use that thing?" Do you want to find out? Rhett turned toward her, his expression caught between shock and something that might have been respect. Clara, put the gun down. No. Clara, they're leaving. Now. She looked at Dalton. Unless you'd like to see if I'm bluffing. Dalton's face was red with fury, but after a long, tense moment, he jerked his horse around. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Clara didn't lower the gun. Next time you cross that fence line, I won't warn you. The three men rode off, disappearing into the trees. Clara stood on the porch, still holding the shotgun, her entire body shaking. Rhett walked over slowly, like he was approaching a spooked animal. You can put it down now. Clara lowered the gun. Her hands were trembling so hard she almost dropped it. Rhett took it from her gently. You ever fired one of these before? No. It's not even loaded. Clara looked at him. Then she started laughing. Not because it was funny, because she'd just threatened 3 armed men with an empty shotgun and somehow survived. Rhett stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. You're insane, he said quietly. You already knew that. Yeah, but now I know how much. He looked toward the trees where the riders had vanished. They'll be back. And next time, they won't leave just because you ask nicely. Then we'll be ready. We. Rhett shook his head. You keep saying that. Because you keep staying. He was quiet for a moment. Then he handed her back the shotgun. Then we better make sure this thing's actually loaded. That night, Rhett taught Clara how to shoot. They went down to the stream where the sound wouldn't carry as far. Rhett loaded the shotgun and showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to brace for the recoil. It's gonna kick, he warned. Hard. Don't lock your elbows or you'll break something. Clara nodded and raised the gun. She aimed at a tree across the stream and pulled the trigger. The blast nearly knocked her off her feet. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, sending pain shooting down her arm. She staggered back, ears ringing. You all right? Rhett was beside her, steadying her. Fine. Clara's shoulder throbbed, but she didn't care. She'd just fired a gun. Hit the tree, barely, but hit it. Let me try again. They practiced until dark. By the end, Clara's shoulder was bruised and her hands were shaking, but she could hit the tree 3 times out of 5. Not bad, Rhett said as they walked back to the cabin. For someone who'd never touched a gun a week ago. I had a good teacher. You had desperation. That's better than any teacher. Clara glanced at him. In the fading light, his face looked different, softer, maybe, less guarded. Why are you really still here? She asked. You could have left days ago. Rhett was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because I've walked away from too many things in my life, and I'm tired of it. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just walked beside him in silence as the stars came out over the valley and the wolves began their nightly howling. Back at the cabin, Garrett was standing, actually standing. He leaned heavily against the table, his face gray with effort, but he was upright. You're going to fall, Clara said, dropping the shotgun and moving toward him. I'm fine. You're an idiot. She helped him back to the cot. He didn't fight her this time. You need more time to heal. I don't have time. Garrett collapsed onto the cot, breathing hard. Dalton's going to come back, and when he does, he'll bring more men. We can't fight them all. We'll figure something out. There's nothing to figure out. This place is done. Garrett looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than resentment in his eyes. Fear. You should leave while you can. Both of you. Clara sat down on the floor beside the cot. I'm not leaving. Why? This place is worthless. The land's too rough. The winters are brutal. Dalton's going to take it anyway. Because it's mine. Clara's voice was steady. I came here for a future, and I'm not giving it up to some bully who thinks he can scare me away. Garrett stared at her. You really are insane. So everyone keeps telling me. Rhett, standing in the doorway, shook his head. You two deserve each other. Clara looked up at him. Does that mean you're staying? Rhett sighed. For now. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. The cold came early that year. 2 weeks after Clara arrived, the temperature dropped so fast she woke one morning to frost covering the inside of the cabin walls. Her breath came out in white clouds. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid overnight. She sat up, teeth chattering, and wrapped both blankets around her shoulders. Across the room, Garrett was still asleep, curled tight on the cot. The fire had died down to nothing but ash. Clara forced herself to stand and stumbled to the stove. Her fingers were so numb she could barely hold the kindling. It took 3 tries to get the fire started, and even then the heat felt pathetic against the cold seeping through every crack in the walls. The door opened and Rhett came in carrying an armload of wood. Ice crystals clung to his coat and beard. His face was red from wind. "It's snowing," he said flatly. Clara looked past him through the open door. Sure enough, white flakes drifted down from a sky the color of old iron. Not heavy yet, but steady. The ground was already covered. "It's only October," she said. "This is Wyoming. Weather doesn't follow rules." Rhett dumped the wood beside the stove and started feeding logs into the fire. "And this is just the beginning. Real winter hits in November." "How bad does it get?" Rhett glanced at her, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "Bad enough that people die." Clara pulled the blankets tighter. "What do we need to do?" "Everything." Rhett straightened and looked around the cabin. "This place won't survive a hard winter, not as it is. We need more firewood, at least 3 cords, maybe 4. We need to seal every gap in these walls or the cold will kill you in your sleep. We need food stored, enough to last 4 months without resupply. And we need it all done in the next 3 weeks. 3 weeks? If we're lucky, could be 2. He walked to the door and stared out at the falling snow. "Once the heavy storms hit, you're trapped. Can't get to town, can't hunt, can't do anything but burn wood and hope you don't run out before spring." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Can we do it? In 3 weeks?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know." Behind them, Garrett coughed and sat up. He looked stronger than he had a week ago, still pale, still thin, but able to move without collapsing. He stared at the snow falling outside and laughed bitterly. "We're dead." "Shut up," Clara said. "It's the truth. This cabin's a death trap. We don't have enough supplies. We don't have help. And that storm's just the start." Garrett swung his legs off the cot, wincing. "You want to survive? Leave now while you still can." "No one's leaving." Clara walked over and stood in front of him. "You gave up weeks ago. I'm not interested in your opinion. My opinion is the only one that matters. This is my land." "Is it?" Clara crossed her arms. "Because from where I stand, I'm the one keeping this place running. I'm the one who bought medicine that saved your life. I'm the one who's been hauling water and chopping wood and making sure you don't starve to death in your own filth." Garrett's face flushed. "I didn't ask for your help." "Too bad. You got it anyway." Clara leaned closer. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over half this land claim to me. Legal and binding, because I've earned it. Like hell I am. Then I'll leave, right now. And you can explain to Dalton why you're here alone with no one to defend the property when he comes back with his sons and takes everything." Clara straightened. "Your choice." Garrett stared at her with pure hatred, but underneath it, she saw fear, because he knew she was right. "Fine," he finally spat. "Take the worthless land. See how long you last." "Longer than you?" Clara turned to Rhett. "Is there anyone in town who can draw up papers, make it legal?" Rhett looked between them like he was watching 2 wildcats fight. "There's a clerk at the land office. He handles claims." "Then we go today, before the snow gets worse." "Clara!" Rhett's voice held a warning. "That storm's moving fast. If we get caught out there—" "We won't." She was already moving, pulling on her coat, wrapping a scarf around her neck. "How long to town?" 4 hours, maybe 5 in the snow." "Then we leave now." Rhett studied her face, then sighed and reached for his hat. "You're going to get us killed." "Probably." Clara grabbed the shotgun from the wall. "But at least I'll own the land I die on." They rode through falling snow that grew heavier with every mile. The horse struggled through drifts already ankle-deep. Wind cut through Clara's coat like knives. Her face went numb. Her hands, even wrapped in cloth, felt like blocks of ice. She clung to Rhett's back and tried not to think about what would happen if they got lost. If the storm got worse. If the horse broke a leg in the snow. But Rhett rode like he'd been born in a saddle. He navigated by landmarks Clara couldn't even see. A specific tree, a rock formation, the slope of the land. He never hesitated. Never doubled back. By the time they reached Bitter Creek, the town was barely visible through the white curtain of snow. Clara slid off the horse on legs that barely held her. Rhett had to catch her arm to keep her from falling. "Can you walk?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Everything hurt. But they'd made it. The land office was a narrow building squeezed between the general store and a building with boarded windows. Inside, a potbelly stove radiated heat that felt like heaven. A thin man with wire spectacles sat behind a desk covered in papers. He looked up as they entered, snow melting off their coats onto his floor. Help you? Need to file a claim modification, Rhett said. Land transfer. The clerk's eyes narrowed. What property? Garrett Homestead, North Valley. Recognition flickered across the man's face. Garrett selling? Splitting the claim. Rhett pulled Clara forward. Half to her. Equal partnership. The clerk looked at Clara like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. Who are you? Clara Whitmore, and I need this done today. Today? In this weather? The clerk shook his head. Can't do it. Garrett needs to be here to sign. Both parties present, witnesses required, filing fee paid. How much? $5. Clara's stomach dropped. She didn't have $5. Didn't have 5 cents. Rhett pulled coins from his pocket and set them on the desk. There. Now draw up the papers. The clerk picked up the coins, counted them, and sighed. This is irregular. So is freezing to death because you wanted to follow procedure. Rhett's voice went hard. Papers, now. The clerk muttered something under his breath but pulled out a form and started writing. Name, location, boundaries, terms. His handwriting was cramped and precise. It took nearly 30 minutes. When he finished, he pushed the paper across the desk. Garrett needs to sign here. You sign here. I need 2 witnesses. I'll witness, Rhett said. You're not independent. You're clearly involved. The clerk looked toward the door. Need someone neutral. Clara felt panic rising. Who in this town would witness anything for her? Everyone looked at her like she was trouble. Then the door opened and the woman from the general store walked in, shaking snow from her coat. Mrs. Chen, the clerk said. Perfect timing. Need a witness for a land transfer. The woman looked at Clara, recognition in her eyes. This the girl who sold her mother's ring? Clara nodded. Mrs. Chen walked over and looked at the papers. She read slowly, carefully. Then she looked at Clara again. You sure about this? That land's cursed. Garrett's been nothing but trouble since he filed the claim. I'm sure. You'll be trapped up there all winter, alone with 2 men. People will talk. Let them. Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen. Your funeral. She signed. The clerk witnessed as well, stamped the paper, and made a copy for his records. He handed the original to Clara. It's legal once Garrett signs. Until then, it's just paper. He'll sign. Clara folded the document carefully and tucked it inside her coat. Thank you. The clerk just grunted and went back to his other paperwork. Outside, the storm had worsened. Snow fell so thick Clara could barely see the buildings across the street. The wind howled like something alive and angry. We can't ride in this, Rhett said, staring at the white void. We'll get lost and freeze before we make it halfway. Then what do we do? Rhett looked up and down the street. Most of the buildings were dark, shut tight against the storm. But the boarding house had lights in the windows. We waited out. They walked through knee-deep snow to Mrs. Halford's. Rhett knocked hard enough to rattle the door. The woman who answered looked even less pleased to see Clara than she had the first time. We're full. We just need shelter from the storm, Rhett said. 1 room. I'll pay double. Mrs. Halford's eyes flicked to Clara. Her too? Yes? Absolutely not. I don't run that kind of establishment. Clara stepped forward, cold and exhausted, and done with this woman's judgment. We're not asking for your approval. We're asking for a room so we don't die in your street. If that's a problem, we'll sleep in your barn and you can explain to everyone why you let 2 people freeze to death. Mrs. Halford's face went red. For a second, Clara thought she'd slam the door. But then she stepped back. 1 room, separate beds, and you're gone the second this storm clears. Deal. The room was small, cold, and smelled like old tobacco. 2 narrow beds stood against opposite walls. A single window looked out at the storm. No stove, no heat except what rose through the floorboards from downstairs. But it was shelter. Clara sat on one of the beds and tried to stop shaking. Rhett stood by the window watching the snow. This'll blow through by morning, he said. We can leave at first light. Clara nodded but didn't trust herself to speak. Now that they'd stopped moving, the exhaustion hit her like a wall. Every muscle ached. Her hands were raw. Her face felt sunburned from the wind. Rhett turned from the window. You should sleep. So should you. I'll keep watch. For what? No one's coming in this weather. Old habit. He sat on the other bed, still wearing his coat, hat pulled low. I don't sleep much anyway. Clara lay down without taking off her boots. The bed was hard, but better than the cabin floor. She pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. Rhett. Yeah? Why did you pay the filing fee? That was your money. He was quiet for a long time. Because you shouldn't have to lose everything just to survive. Clara wanted to ask what he meant. Wanted to know what had happened to him that made him understand loss so well. But her body was shutting down, pulling her toward sleep. Thank you, she whispered. No answer. Maybe he hadn't heard, or maybe he just didn't know what to say. Clara drifted off to the sound of wind battering the walls and snow hissing against the window. She woke in darkness to voices downstairs, angry voices, men arguing. Clara sat up. Across the room, Rhett was already on his feet, hand on the rifle he'd brought inside. Stay here, he said quietly. What's happening? Don't know. He moved to the door and opened it carefully. The voices grew louder. Clara recognized one of them, Dalton. She got up and followed Rhett to the top of the stairs. Below, in the boarding house parlor, Dalton and his two sons stood dripping melted snow onto Mrs. Halford's floor. The old woman looked furious. I don't care what you think you saw, she was saying. I run a respectable house. Now get out before I call the sheriff. There is no sheriff, one of Dalton's sons said. And we know Garrett's woman is here, saw them ride in. She's not Garrett's woman, she's a paying guest. She's a squatter on disputed land. Dalton's voice was hard. And I want to talk to her. Well, she doesn't want to talk to you. Mrs. Halford crossed her arms. So you can leave, or I can get my shotgun. Dalton took a step forward. Old woman, touch her and you'll regret it. Rhett's voice cut through the room like a blade. Everyone looked up to see him at the top of the stairs, rifle in hand, pointed directly at Dalton. The room went silent. Dalton's face twisted. You threatening me, Mercer? Just making a promise. Rhett descended the stairs slowly, never lowering the rifle. You've got business with Garrett. That's between you and him. But Clara's got nothing to do with your land dispute. So you're going to walk out that door and leave her alone. The hell I am. That woman's living on property I've got a claim to. No, you don't. Clara came down the stairs behind Rhett, holding the folded paper from the land office. This is a legal transfer. Half that land is mine now, filed and witnessed. If you want to contest it, you can take it up with the clerk. She handed the paper to Dalton. He snatched it, read it, and his face went dark red. This is fraud. It's legal. Clara met his eyes. And if you set foot on my property again without permission, I'll shoot you myself. Dalton crumpled the paper and threw it at her feet. You have no idea what you've gotten into. I know exactly what I've gotten into. A fight. And I don't lose fights. One of Dalton's sons laughed. Big words from a city girl. Then test me. Clara bent and picked up the paper, smoothing it carefully. Come to my property. Cross my fence. See what happens. Dalton stared at her with pure hatred. Then he turned and shoved his way out the door, his sons following. The silence after they left felt fragile, like glass about to break. Mrs. Halford looked at Clara with something between shock and grudging respect. You got more spine than sense, girl. I get that a lot. The old woman shook her head. Dalton's not the type to back down. He'll come at you harder now. Then I'll hit back harder. Clara folded the paper and tucked it back inside her coat. I'm done being scared. Mrs. Halford studied her for a long moment. Then she sighed. Room's yours till morning. No charge. Figure you've earned that much. Thank you. Clara and Rhett went back upstairs. Neither of them spoke until the door closed. That was stupid, Rhett said quietly. I know. He's going to come after you now. Hard. I know that too. Then why did you do it? Clara sat on the bed and looked at him. Because I'm tired of running. Tired of being pushed around. Tired of letting people like him win. She pulled off her boots, wincing as feeling came back into her frozen feet. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe I'll regret it. But at least I'll go down fighting. Rhett stood by the door, rifle still in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You really don't quit, do you? Not anymore. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close. Then I guess we better make sure you don't die. We, Clara said softly. You keep saying that too. This time Rhett did smile. Small and tired, but real. Yeah, guess I do. The storm cleared before dawn. They rode back through a landscape transformed by snow. Everything was white and silent. The world muffled and strange. The horse struggled through drifts that came up to its chest in places. What should have taken 4 hours took nearly 7. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high, and Clara was so cold she couldn't feel her hands or feet. Rhett practically carried her inside and set her by the fire while he went to tend the horse. Garrett was awake, sitting at the table with a blanket around his shoulders. He looked at Clara like she'd risen from the dead. "You actually made it back. Did you think I wouldn't?" "Honestly, no." He gestured at the paper she pulled from her coat. "That what I think it is?" Clara unfolded it and set it on the table. "Half the land is mine now. You just need to sign." Garrett stared at the paper, at the signatures already there, at the official stamp from the land office. "You really did it." "Yes." He picked up the pen Clara had brought from town. For a moment she thought he might refuse, might tear the paper up out of spite, but then he signed his name in shaky letters and pushed the paper back across the table. "There. Happy now?" Clara picked up the paper and stared at his signature. Her hands trembled. She'd done it. The land was legally hers. "No," she said quietly. "But it's a start." Garrett laughed, bitter and tired. "You're going to regret this. This land will kill you. The winter, the isolation, Dalton and his sons. You think you're strong enough to handle it, but you're not. No one is." "Then I'll die trying." Clara folded the paper and put it away. "But I won't die running." Garrett shook his head and lay back down on the cot, turning his face to the wall like always. Rhett came back inside, covered in snow. Horses settled, gave him extra feed. He looked at Clara. "You get it signed?" She nodded. "Good, because we've got bigger problems." He walked to the window and stared out. "Saw tracks coming down from the ridge, fresh ones. Someone was watching the cabin while we were gone." Clara stood. "Dalton?" "Probably, or his sons." Rhett turned to face her. "They're scouting, figuring out our patterns. How many people are here? Where the weaknesses are. What do we do?" "We get ready." Rhett started pulling supplies from the shelves. "Because when they come, and they will come, we're going to be prepared." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Rhett taught Clara everything he knew about defense. Where to position yourself in a fight. How to reload fast. How to shoot to wound instead of kill, because killing a man brought consequences even in the frontier. They fortified the cabin as best they could. Rhett boarded up one window entirely and built shutters for the others, thick wood that could stop a bullet if needed. He reinforced the door with extra planks and metal hinges scavenged from the barn. Clara chopped firewood until her hands bled, then kept chopping. They needed enough to last months. Every log mattered. Every piece of kindling could mean the difference between survival and freezing. Garrett, stronger now, helped where he could. He was still weak, still bitter, but he worked, fixed tools, mended harnesses, sorted through supplies, and made lists of what they'd need from town before the heavy snows came. The three of them fell into an uneasy rhythm, not quite trust, but cooperation born from necessity. And every day, Clara waited for Dalton to return. He came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the first snow. Clara was outside hauling water when she heard horses. Multiple horses. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin. "They're here!" Rhett grabbed his rifle. Garrett struggled to his feet. Clara took the shotgun from the wall and checked to make sure it was loaded. 8 riders came out of the trees. Dalton and his sons, plus 5 other men Clara didn't recognize. They stopped just beyond the fence line, forming a wall of horses and hostile faces. Dalton sat in the middle, grinning. "Morning, Mercer, Miss Whitmore?" Clara stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. Rhett stood beside her, rifle ready. Behind them, Garrett appeared in the doorway, pale, but armed with a pistol. "Get off my property," Clara said. "Can't do that." "See, we've got a problem." Dalton gestured at the land around them. "This valley's too small for weak neighbors, and you 3 are about the weakest I've ever seen." "Then you should be worried," Clara said. "Because we're still here." One of the other men laughed. "Not for long. Winter's coming. You'll be dead before spring." "Maybe. But if we go, we're taking you with us." Clara raised the shotgun. "That a risk you want to take?" Dalton's grin faded. "You're bluffing. Try me." The men shifted in their saddles. Clara saw uncertainty in their faces. She was counting on it. Most bullies backed down when their victims fought back. But Dalton wasn't most bullies. "All right," he said quietly. "You want to play tough? Let's see how tough you really are." He turned to his sons. "Burn the barn." "No!" Garrett shouted. Two of the men dismounted and pulled torches from their saddles. They'd come prepared. Rhett fired. The bullet hit the ground 2 feet in front of the men, kicking up dirt. They froze. Next one's not a warning, Rhett said. Dalton pulled his own rifle. Neither is this. Everything happened at once. Garrett fired from the doorway, hitting one of the horses. The animal screamed and reared. The other men scattered, pulling weapons, shouting. Clara fired the shotgun at the barn, not at the men, at the ground near their feet. The blast was deafening. The men ran back to their horses. Rhett fired again, this time at Dalton's hat. It flew off his head. The message was clear. Next shot wouldn't miss. Dalton grabbed his hat, fury twisting his face. You'll regret this! Go home, Dalton, Rhett said calmly, before someone gets hurt. For a terrible moment, Clara thought Dalton would charge, would call their bluff and start a war none of them would survive. But then he yanked his horse around and rode off, his men following. Clara stood on the porch, shaking so hard she could barely hold the shotgun. Her ears rang from the blast. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They'd survived. Barely. Rhett lowered his rifle and turned to Garrett. You hit that horse on purpose? Seemed like the right target. It was. Rhett looked at Clara. You all right? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Good, because that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning. Rhett walked to the edge of the porch and stared at the empty trail. Dalton's not going to stop. Not now. We embarrassed him in front of his men. He'll come back bigger, meaner. Then we'll be ready, Clara said. Garrett leaned against the door frame, exhausted. We can't fight 8 men, not long term. We don't have to fight them. We just have to outlast them. Clara set down the shotgun. Winter's coming. They can't attack in a blizzard. And once spring hits, we'll have the whole season to reinforce. And if they come before the snow, then we fight. Clara looked at both men. I didn't come all this way to give up now. Garrett stared at her. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. The resentment faded. Not completely, but enough. You're tougher than I thought, he said quietly. So are you. He almost smiled. We're all going to die up here. Probably. Clara picked up her water bucket. But at least we'll die fighting. Rhett shook his head. You're both insane. And you're still here, Clara pointed out. Yeah. Rhett looked out at the mountains, at the valley they were fighting to keep. Guess I am. That night, the 3 of them sat around the fire and made plans. Not grand strategies, just practical steps for survival. More wood, better defenses, scouting patrols to watch for movement, and a backup plan if Dalton came with more men than they could handle. It wasn't much, but it was something. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature dropped. The first real storm of winter was building in the north. Clara could feel it in the air, that particular cold that promised snow measured in feet, not inches. They had maybe a week before the valley became impassable. 1 week to finish preparations. 1 week before winter locked them in with their choices. Clara lay on her blanket that night and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Pennsylvania, about the boarding house and the nephew with wandering hands and the life she'd left behind. She didn't miss any of it. This cabin was cold and drafty and surrounded by people who wanted her gone. But it was hers. She'd fought for it, bled for it, nearly died for it, and she wasn't giving it up. Not to Dalton, not to Winter, not to anyone. Clara Whitmore had spent 22 years being unwanted and discarded. Those days were over. Whatever came next, storm or siege or death itself, she'd face it standing. And she wouldn't face it alone. The storm hit 3 days later with a violence that made the earlier snowfall look gentle. Clara woke to a sound like the world tearing apart. Wind screamed through the valley, slamming against the cabin walls hard enough to shake the entire structure. Snow didn't just fall, it flew sideways, horizontal sheets of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet. She scrambled out of her blanket and ran to the window. Nothing but white. The barn was invisible. The trees were gone. Even the ground had disappeared into the storm. How long will it last? She asked. Rhett was already awake, feeding the fire. Could be a day, could be a week. He glanced at the door. Either way, we're not going outside. Garrett sat up on the cot, coughing. The cold had settled into his chest again, making every breath sound wet and labored. We're trapped. We're sheltered, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Not much of one. Clara ignored him and started taking inventory. They had maybe 2 weeks of food if they rationed carefully. 3 cords of wood stacked inside and another 2 in the barn they couldn't reach. Water was the immediate problem. The bucket was nearly empty, and the stream was too far to access in this weather. We need to melt snow, she said. Rhett nodded. I'll handle it. You focus on keeping the fire going and making sure we don't burn through our wood too fast. They fell into a rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Feed the fire, melt snow for water, cook simple meals of beans and flour, sleep when exhaustion demanded it. Wake and repeat. The first day passed in a blur of cold and noise. The storm battered the cabin relentlessly, finding every weakness, every crack. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Snow seeped under the door. The temperature inside dropped so low Clara could see her breath even standing next to the fire. By the second day, they were all huddled near the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Conversation died. There was nothing to say. They just existed, hour by hour, trying not to freeze. On the third day, Garrett's cough got worse. Clara woke to the sound of him struggling to breathe. She crawled over to the cot and felt his forehead, burning hot. He's got fever again, she said. Rhett came over and looked. Even in the dim light, Garrett's face looked gray. We used the last of the medicine 2 weeks ago. Then we need more. In case you haven't noticed, we're trapped in a blizzard. I noticed. Clara stood and walked to the shelves, searching for anything that might help. Willow bark. Honey. Even whiskey would be better than nothing. But the shelves were nearly bare. She thought about what her mother used to do when Clara was sick as a child. Hot water with honey if they had it. Warm compresses, keep the fever from climbing too high. They didn't have honey, but they had hot water. Clara heated water on the stove, soaked a cloth, and pressed it to Garrett's forehead. He flinched at the heat but didn't protest. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and fast. You're going to be fine, Clara said, not knowing if it was true. Garrett's eyes opened. He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude or might have been resignation. Why do you care? Because someone has to. I treated you like dirt. Yeah, you did. Clara wrung out the cloth and pressed it to his neck. But that doesn't mean I want you to die. Garrett closed his eyes again. You're strange. I get that a lot. She stayed beside him for hours, changing the compress, giving him sips of water, monitoring the fever. Rhett kept the fire going and cooked what passed for meals. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say that the storm wasn't already screaming. On the fourth day, something changed. Clara woke to silence. Not complete silence. The wind still blew, the cabin still creaked, but the roar had diminished. The wall-shaking violence had passed. She got up and looked out the window. The storm was still there, but lighter. She could actually see shapes now, the barn, the fence line, trees bent under the weight of snow but still standing. It's breaking, Rhett said behind her. How much snow? 4 feet at least, maybe 5. He pulled on his coat. I need to check the barn. Make sure it didn't collapse. I'll come with you. No, you stay with Garrett. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, something went wrong. Clara wanted to argue, but knew he was right. Someone needed to stay with Garrett, and Rhett knew the property better than she did. She watched him open the door. Snow had drifted against it, creating a wall that came up to his waist. He shoved through it and disappeared into the white. Clara went back to Garrett. His fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him weak but conscious. He watched her with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in days. Storm's passing, she said. I heard. He tried to sit up, failed, and settled back onto the cot. How bad is it? Deep. But we're alive. For now. Garrett coughed, winced, and pressed a hand to his chest. Winter's just started. This is the first storm of many. Then we'll survive the next one too. You really believe that? Clara sat on the floor beside the cot. I have to. What's the alternative? Garrett was quiet for a moment, then he said something Clara never expected. I'm sorry. She looked at him. For what? For lying. For bringing you here under false pretenses. For being a coward. He stared at the ceiling. I thought I could build something here. Thought I was strong enough. But this land broke me before I even started. You're not broken. You're just tired. Same thing. Garrett turned his head to look at her. Why did you stay? When you found out the truth, you could have left. Should have left. Clara thought about it. About the train depot. About standing in the snow with nowhere to go and no one waiting. About the moment she decided to fight instead of run. Because I was tired of being unwanted, she said quietly. Tired of being the person everyone threw away. And I figured if I was going to fail, at least it would be on my own terms. That's the stupidest reason I've ever heard. Probably,
Clara smiled. But it's my reason.
Garrett almost smiled back. Almost. You're tougher than I gave you credit for. So are you. You just forgot for a while. The door banged open and Rhett came back in, covered head to toe in snow. He stomped his boots and shook himself like a wet dog. Barn standing, horses alive, but we lost part of the roof on the east side. Snow's getting in. Can it be fixed? Clara asked. Not until this storm clears completely, but it'll hold for now. Rhett pulled off his coat and hung it near the fire. We've got a bigger problem, though. What? Saw smoke to the west. Someone else is out there, close. Clara's stomach tightened. Dalton? Maybe, or someone else struggling to survive. Rhett crouched by the fire, warming his hands. Either way, we need to be ready. When this storm ends, people are going to be desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. He was right. Clara had learned that lesson well. The storm finally broke on the 6th day. Clara stepped outside into a world transformed. Snow covered everything. Smooth white drifts that buried the fence posts, reached halfway up the cabin walls, and made the landscape unrecognizable. The sky was clear and brutally blue. The sun reflected off the snow so bright it hurt to look at. Beautiful. And deadly. Rhett was already working, digging paths from the cabin to the barn, from the barn to the woodpile. Clara grabbed a shovel and joined him. The work was brutal. Every shovelful felt like lifting lead. Her back screamed. Her arms shook. But they cleared the paths. Garrett, still weak, helped where he could. He sorted through supplies, checked tools, made lists of what they'd need if another storm hit. He didn't complain, didn't argue, just worked. Something had changed between the three of them during those 6 days trapped inside. Not friendship exactly, but understanding. They were in this together now, bound by circumstance and stubbornness and the simple fact that none of them had anywhere else to go. 2 days after the storm cleared, riders appeared on the ridge. Clara was hauling water when she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, barely visible against the snow. They weren't moving, just watching. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin. Someone's up on the ridge. Rhett grabbed his rifle and went outside. He stared at the ridge for a long moment, then lowered the gun slightly. That's not Dalton. How do you know? Wrong horses, wrong posture. Rhett squinted against the glare. They're just watching, probably other settlers checking to see who survived. Should we signal them? No, we don't know if they're friendly. He turned back to the cabin. But we keep eyes on that ridge. If they come closer, we'll find out what they want. The riders stayed for another 10 minutes, then disappeared back into the trees. Clara felt uneasy for the rest of the day. The sensation of being watched lingered like a bad taste. She found herself checking the ridge constantly, looking for movement, expecting trouble. It came 3 days later, but not from where she expected. Clara was in the barn checking on the horse when she heard shouting. She ran outside to find a man stumbling through the snow toward the cabin. He was thin, ragged, covered in ice. His lips were blue. He could barely walk. Rhett met him halfway, rifle ready. Who are you? The man collapsed. Please, need help. My family. Where's your family? Rhett crouched beside him. South Ridge, cabin collapsed. Wife and 2 children, trapped. The man grabbed Rhett's coat. Please, they're freezing. Clara ran over. How far? 2 miles, maybe less. The man was shaking so hard he could barely speak. I tried to dig them out, couldn't. Roof caved in. They're buried. Rhett looked at Clara. She saw the calculation in his eyes. 2 miles in deep snow, a collapsed cabin. People possibly already dead. It was a risk. A huge risk. But Clara thought about being trapped. About being buried and alone and waiting for someone to care enough to help. We have to go, she said. Clara, we have to. Rhett stared at her. Then he sighed and stood. Get shovels, rope, blankets. He looked at the man. Can you walk? The man nodded, though he looked ready to collapse again. Then let's move, before they freeze to death. They rode through snow that came up to the horse's chest. The man, his name was Samuel, he told them between gasps, had come from a homestead south of Garrett's land. He and his wife had claimed it last spring, built a cabin, planned to start a farm. Then winter came early, the storms, the isolation, and this morning their roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. I got out through a window, Samuel said, his voice shaking. But my wife, Sarah, she was holding the baby, and our son was trapped under the beams. I tried to move them, couldn't, had to get help. How long ago? Rhett asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. Too long. Clara knew it. Rhett knew it. But neither of them said it out loud. They reached the homestead just as the sun started to set. The cabin had been small to begin with, not much bigger than a shed. Now it was just a pile of broken logs and snow. No smoke, no sound. Clara's heart sank. Rhett dismounted and started digging. Clara joined him. Samuel tried to help but was too weak, too exhausted. He just stood there, staring at the wreckage of his home, shaking. They dug for 10 minutes before they found the first body. A woman, frozen, clutching a bundle wrapped in blankets. Rhett pulled her out carefully. She wasn't breathing. Clara unwrapped the bundle. Inside was an infant, maybe 6 months old, blue lips, closed eyes, not breathing. "No," Samuel whispered. "No, no, no." Clara pressed her ear to the baby's chest. Nothing. She tilted the tiny head back, cleared the nose and mouth, and breathed into it. Once, twice, nothing. She tried again. Breathed. Compressed the small chest gently. Breathed again. The baby coughed. Clara nearly dropped it. The tiny body jerked, coughed again, and started crying. A weak, pitiful sound, but alive. She wrapped the baby tight and handed it to Samuel, who collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "Keep it warm," Clara said. "Against your chest. Don't let go." She turned back to the wreckage. "There's still a boy." They dug faster. Rhett found him 10 feet deeper, trapped under a beam. He was older, maybe 4, and unconscious. Rhett pulled him out and checked for breathing. "He's alive." "Barely." Clara took off her coat and wrapped it around the boy. "We need to get them warm, now." They couldn't go back to Garrett's cabin. It was too far, and the children wouldn't survive the ride. Samuel's cabin was destroyed. That left one option. "There's a hunting shelter about a mile east," Rhett said. "Stone structure. It'll hold heat better than nothing." They rode hard through the darkening woods. Samuel clutched the baby. Clara held the boy, feeling his shallow breathing against her chest. Rhett navigated by memory and instinct. The shelter was exactly what Rhett promised. A small stone structure built into the side of a hill. It had a fire pit, a dirt floor, and not much else. But it was solid, windproof. Rhett got a fire going while Clara laid the boy near the flames and rubbed his hands, his feet, trying to force blood back into his extremities. The boy's eyes fluttered open once, unfocused, then closed again. "Stay with me," Clara whispered. "Come on, stay." Samuel sat against the wall, the baby pressed against his bare chest under his shirt, sharing body heat. Tears ran down his face silently. "Sarah," he said quietly. "I couldn't save her." Clara didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. The woman was dead, frozen in the snow, and her husband would carry that for the rest of his life. But the children were alive. That had to count for something. They stayed in the shelter through the night. Clara monitored the boy, who drifted in and out of consciousness. The baby cried periodically, weak and hungry. Samuel gave it water mixed with a little sugar from a tin Rhett carried. It wasn't enough, but it was something. By morning, the boy was awake and aware. Confused, scared, but alive. Samuel looked at Clara with eyes full of grief and gratitude. "You saved them." "We all did," Clara said. "No, you brought them back." He touched the boy's head gently. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to. Just keep them alive." They rode back to Garrett's cabin at midday. Samuel and his children came with them. There was nowhere else to go. The wreckage of their homestead was uninhabitable. They had no supplies, no shelter, no way to survive alone. Garrett took one look at the refugees and sighed. "We don't have room." "We'll make room," Clara said. "We barely have enough food for 3 people." "Then we'll ration for 5. Garrett opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked at the children, the boy staring around with wide, traumatized eyes, the baby wrapped in every blanket they could spare. And something in his face softened. "Fine, but they work. Everyone works." "Fair enough," Samuel said quietly. The cabin got crowded fast. 5 people in a space meant for 1. They slept in shifts, ate in shifts, took turns by the fire. It was cramped and uncomfortable and occasionally tense. But it worked. Samuel proved useful. He knew carpentry, metalwork, basic medicine. He helped Rhett reinforce the barn roof, showed Clara how to make traps for small game, taught them all how to stretch their food further. The boy, his name was Daniel, slowly came back to life. He didn't talk much, but he followed Clara everywhere, helping with chores, learning to chop kindling, fetching water. The baby, Emma, cried often, but was gaining strength. Clara had never taken care of an infant before. She learned by necessity, by trial and error, by sheer determination not to let the child die after they'd fought so hard to save her. Garrett watched it all with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Sometimes he seemed annoyed by the noise and chaos. Other times she caught him staring at the children with something that looked almost like longing. One night, after everyone else had fallen asleep, he spoke quietly from his cot. "I had a son once." Clara, lying on her blanket by the fire, froze. "What?" "Back in Ohio. Before I came here." Garrett's voice was rough. "He died. Fever. He was 3. Clara didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. "That's why I left. Couldn't stand being there. Couldn't stand seeing other children and knowing mine was gone." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I thought coming here would fix it. Thought starting over in a new place would make it hurt less. But it doesn't. It never does." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "Yeah, me too." Garrett rolled over, facing the wall. "But maybe saving these ones counts for something." Clara lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways people carried their pain, about how everyone in this cabin was running from something or trying to survive something or both, and about how sometimes the only way forward was together. A week after Samuel arrived, riders appeared again. This time there were more, at least a dozen. And they weren't just watching from the ridge, they rode straight toward the cabin. Rhett saw them first. "Everyone inside, now!" Clara grabbed Daniel and ran. Samuel scooped up Emma. They crowded into the cabin while Rhett and Garrett took positions by the windows with rifles. The riders stopped 20 feet from the cabin. But they weren't Dalton's men. They were families, men, women, a few children. All of them looked exhausted, desperate. An older man rode forward. "We're not looking for trouble." "Then what do you want?" Rhett called from the window. "Shelter, food if you can spare it. We got caught in the storm, lost our supplies. 3 families dead already." The man gestured at the people behind him. "We heard someone here survived. Hoped you might help." Clara looked at the faces outside. Gaunt. Frostbitten. Some of them were crying quietly. She thought about the baby she'd brought back to life, about Daniel's traumatized eyes, about Samuel losing his wife in the snow. She thought about being the one standing outside in the cold, begging for help. "Let them in," she said. Rhett turned. "Clara, we can't leave them out there. They'll die. We can barely feed the people we have. Then we'll figure something out." Clara stood and walked to the door. "But I'm not letting them freeze." She opened the door before anyone could stop her. The older man stared at her. "You're willing to help?" "Yes, but I need something in return." "What?" Clara looked at the group. Maybe 20 people total. Families, stragglers, survivors. And she made a decision that would change everything. We work together. Everyone. We pool our supplies, our skills, our labor. We don't fight over land or boundaries or who owns what. We survive as a group. And when spring comes, we build something real here, a real community. The man blinked. "You're serious?" "Completely." Clara crossed her arms. "But if anyone wants to keep fighting, keep hoarding, keep thinking only about themselves, they can leave now. Because I'm done with that. We either do this together or we all die separately." The people looked at each other. Some nodded, some looked skeptical. But no one rode away. The older man dismounted and held out his hand. "Name's William Rourke. Used to be a foreman in Colorado. I can organize work crews, coordinate resources." Clara shook his hand. "Clara Whitmore. I can't promise we'll all make it, but I can promise we'll try." Rourke smiled grimly. "That's more than we had 5 minutes ago." They came inside, as many as would fit. The rest set up temporary shelter in the barn, in lean-tos built against the cabin walls, anywhere they could block the wind. It was chaos. Cramped and loud and overwhelming, but it was also something else. It was hope. Rhett pulled Clara aside later that night. "You realize what you just did? Saved a bunch of people from freezing? You started something, made promises. These people are going to expect you to lead them through the winter." Clara looked around the crowded cabin, at Samuel comforting his children, at families huddled by the fire, at strangers who were becoming something more. "Then I guess I better figure out how." Rhett stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head, almost smiling. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the craziest." "Still can it be both?" "Yeah," Rhett said quietly. "I guess it can." Outside, the wind picked up again. Another storm was building. Clara could feel it, but this time they wouldn't face it alone. The second storm came harder than the first. It hit on a moonless night with winds that sounded like freight trains roaring through the valley. Snow fell so thick Clara couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The cabin shook, the barn groaned, and 23 people huddled in whatever shelter they could find, praying the structures would hold. Clara moved through the chaos, checking on families, distributing blankets, making sure children stayed close to the fire. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her body ran on something beyond exhaustion, pure will and the knowledge that if she stopped moving, people would die. William Rourke worked beside her, organizing shifts, rationing food, keeping panic from spreading. The man was 60 if he was a day, but he moved like someone half his age, driven by the same stubborn refusal to quit that kept Clara going. "We're burning through firewood too fast," he said quietly, so the others wouldn't hear. "At this rate, we've got maybe 4 days before we run out." Then we cut back. Smaller fires. More people sharing warmth. "It's already below freezing in here at night." "Then we'll get colder." Clara looked at the families pressed together near the stove. "But we'll stay alive." Rourke studied her face. "You really think we're going to make it?" "I don't know, but I'm not going to stop trying until I'm dead." He almost smiled. "Remind me never to bet against you." The storm lasted 11 days. 11 days of howling wind and endless snow. 11 days of cold so brutal that water froze solid within minutes of leaving the stove. 11 days of fear and hunger and the constant question of whether they'd see another sunrise. People got sick. A woman named Martha developed pneumonia and spent 3 days burning with fever while Clara and Samuel took turns trying to keep her alive. An older man, Rourke's friend, had his fingers turned black from frostbite. They saved his life but couldn't save his hand. 2 children developed infections from wounds they'd gotten during the first storm. Clara treated them with boiled water and cloth bandages and prayers she didn't quite believe in, because what else was there? One of them lived, the other didn't. Clara held the mother while she wept over her daughter's body, and something inside Clara hardened into steel. She'd spent her whole life being soft, being the girl who got pushed around, discarded, forgotten. That girl was gone. Whoever Clara was now, whoever she was becoming, she was forged in this cold and built from the determination to keep people alive even when everything tried to kill them. On the 12th day, the storm broke. Clara stepped outside into a world buried under 6 feet of snow. The sun was so bright it hurt. The air was so cold it felt like breathing glass. But it was quiet. Finally, blessedly quiet. Behind her, Rhett emerged from the barn where he'd been sleeping with half the men to make room in the cabin for families. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. His beard was longer, shot through with gray she hadn't noticed before. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. "Everyone alive?" he asked. "Most of them." Clara didn't elaborate, couldn't. The little girl's face was still too fresh in her mind. Rhett nodded. He understood. "We need to take stock, see what we've got left." They did, and the numbers were brutal. Food, maybe 10 days if they rationed strictly. Firewood, a week at most. Medicine, gone. Ammunition, running low. And winter wasn't even half over. Clara sat at the table that night with Rourke, Rhett, Garrett, and Samuel, trying to figure out how to keep 21 people alive with resources meant for 3. "We could hunt," Samuel suggested. "Deer, elk, something." "In this snow?" Garrett shook his head. "Animals are either dead or holed up where we can't reach them." "Then we send someone to town," Rourke said. "Buy supplies." "With what money?" Clara asked. "We've got nothing left to trade." Silence fell over the table. Everyone knew the truth, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. They were out of options. Then Rhett spoke quietly. "There's one thing we haven't tried." Everyone looked at him. "Dalton?" Clara felt her stomach drop. "You want to ask our enemy for help?" "I want to make a deal." Rhett leaned forward. "Dalton's got supplies, food, resources. He's been trying to take this land for months, so we offer him something he can't refuse." "What?" "Peace. A real agreement. He stops threatening us, we stop shooting at him, and we work together to survive the winter." Garrett laughed bitterly. "He'll never go for it." "He might." Rhett looked at Clara. "If she's the one asking." Clara stared at him. "Me? You're the one who organized this, the one everyone's following. If anyone can convince Dalton that cooperation's better than conquest, it's you. He hates me. Yeah, but he also respects you. I saw it in his eyes when you stood on that porch with the shotgun. He knows you're not backing down. Rhett's voice was steady. And right now, respect's worth more than hatred. Clara looked around the table. At Garrett, who'd given up his bitterness to work alongside strangers. At Samuel, who'd lost everything but kept fighting. At Rourke, who'd trusted her enough to follow her lead. At Rhett, who'd stayed when he could have left a dozen times. All right, she said. I'll try. The ride to Dalton's property took most of the day. Clara went with Rhett and Rourke, leaving Garrett in charge of the camp. The snow was so deep the horse could barely move. They had to dismount and walk half the distance, breaking trail through drifts that came up to their waists. By the time they reached Dalton's ranch, Clara was exhausted and frozen and questioning every decision that had led her here. Dalton's place was bigger than she'd expected. A main house, 2 barns, several outbuildings. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Livestock huddled in pens cleared of snow. The man had resources, real resources. Clara felt a flash of anger. While her people were starving, Dalton and his family lived comfortably, but she pushed the feeling down. Anger wouldn't help, not now. They approached the main house and knocked. One of Dalton's sons opened the door, saw Clara, and his face went hard. You got nerve showing up here. I need to talk to your father. He doesn't want to talk to you. Tell him anyway. The son disappeared inside. Voices rose, angry, suspicious. Then Dalton himself appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. Give me one reason I shouldn't shoot you right now. Clara met his eyes. Because I'm offering you something you want. And what's that? An end to this. No more fighting, no more threats, just neighbors trying to survive. Dalton laughed. You think I need you to survive? I've got food, fuel, and enough ammunition to outlast 3 winters. Then you're lucky. We're not. Clara stepped closer. I've got 21 people living in a cabin meant for 1. We're out of food, out of medicine. We've already lost a child, and we've got months of winter left. That's your problem. It's everyone's problem. Clara's voice stayed level. Because when desperate people run out of options, they do desperate things, like raiding your supplies, burning your barns, taking by force what they can't get peacefully. Dalton's eyes narrowed. You threatening me? I'm telling you the truth. You can keep fighting us, keep trying to take land that's legally ours, and we'll fight back until we're all dead. Or you can help us survive the winter, and in spring we'll negotiate a real agreement, one that benefits everyone. Why would I negotiate when I can just wait for you to freeze and take what I want? Clara looked him dead in the eye. Because I watched a 4-year-old boy almost die in the snow. Because I held a mother while she buried her daughter. Because I'm tired of watching good people suffer when there's another way. She paused, then added quietly, and because deep down, you're tired of it too. Dalton stared at her. Behind him, his sons watched. His wife appeared in the doorway, a worn-looking woman with kind eyes. The silence stretched. Then Dalton's wife spoke. James, let them in. Dalton turned to look at his wife. She held his gaze steadily, and something passed between them, some conversation they'd had before, some argument she'd already won. Dalton sighed and lowered his rifle. Fine. Come inside. They sat around Dalton's table, oak, solid, surrounded by chairs that matched. Real furniture. Real plates. The kind of home Clara had imagined when she read Thomas Garrett's letter all those months ago. Dalton's wife, Margaret, served coffee. Actual coffee. Clara hadn't tasted it in weeks. She wrapped her hands around the cup and felt warmth seep into her frozen fingers. State your case, Dalton said. Clara laid it out plainly. Her people needed food and medicine to survive the winter. In exchange, they'd offer labor in spring, help with planting, building, whatever Dalton needed. They'd also formalize the land boundaries, ending the dispute that had started this whole conflict. And if I say no, Dalton asked, then we all lose. You lose neighbors who could have been allies. We lose people who don't deserve to die, and this valley becomes known as the place where stubbornness mattered more than survival. Dalton was quiet for a long time. His sons looked ready to argue, but Margaret spoke first. We have food to spare. Medicine, too. It's been a hard winter for everyone. She looked at her husband. Helping them doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. One of the sons scoffed. They're squatters. They're people, Margaret said firmly, and we're not letting them starve on principle. Dalton stared at his wife, then at Clara, then at the table. If I do this, he finally said, I want something more than spring labor. What? I want a stake in whatever you're building. A partnership. Not ownership. I know that land's yours now. But if you're creating a community up there, I want my family to be part of it. Real part. Equal say in decisions. Clara glanced at Rourke. He nodded slightly. Deal, Clara said. But we vote on major decisions. Everyone gets a voice. Fair enough, Dalton held out his hand. But if your people cause trouble, this agreement's over. Clara shook his hand. His grip was firm, testing. My people won't cause trouble. We're too busy trying not to die. Dalton almost smiled. You're tougher than you look. I get that a lot. They loaded 2 wagons with supplies. Sacks of flour and beans, dried meat, jars of preserves, Margaret insisted they take. Medicine, blankets, even a small bag of coffee that made Clara want to cry. As they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Clara aside. You're doing something brave, she said quietly. Building a community. Keeping people alive. Don't let the men take credit when it's over. Clara smiled tiredly. I don't care about credit. I just care about surviving. That's why you'll succeed. Margaret pressed something into Clara's hand, a small wooden cross on a string. For luck. Clara started to hand it back. She'd stopped believing in luck or prayers or anything that required faith. But Margaret closed Clara's fingers around it. Just in case, the older woman said. Clara pocketed it and climbed onto the wagon. The ride back was easier with full supplies and the knowledge that they might actually survive this. When they reached the cabin, people came running. They saw the wagons and started crying, actually crying. Rourke organized the unloading. Clara distributed food immediately, not full meals yet, but enough to ease the hunger that had been clawing at everyone for days. That night, they ate together. All 21 people crowded into and around the cabin, sharing the first real meal they'd had in weeks. It wasn't fancy, just bean soup and bread. But it was hot and filling and earned through negotiation instead of violence. Samuel's son Daniel sat beside Clara, spooning soup into his mouth like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Baby Emma slept in her father's arms, finally peaceful. Martha, recovered from pneumonia, laughed at something Rourke said. Garrett caught Clara's eye from across the room. He raised his cup slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. Rhett sat on the porch, keeping watch even though the threat had passed. Clara brought him soup and sat beside him. You did good today, he said. We did good. No, this was you. Rhett looked at her. You made Dalton back down without firing a shot. That takes something most people don't have. What's that? The ability to see past the fight to what matters. Clara sipped her soup. It was cooling fast in the night air. I'm just tired of losing people. I know. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really stay? When you found out Garrett lied? When you saw how bad it was? You could have left, should have left. But you didn't. Why? Clara thought about it, about the train depot, about standing alone in the snow, about every moment she'd been unwanted, discarded, told she wasn't enough. Because leaving meant admitting I was worthless, she finally said, that no one would ever want me, that I'd always be the girl people threw away, and I couldn't live with that. So I stayed, and I fought, and somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for survival and started fighting for something bigger. What's that? The chance to matter, to build something that lasts, to prove that the abandoned girl from Pennsylvania was worth more than anyone thought. Rhett was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You've already proved that. Clara looked at him. In the dim light from the cabin, his face was different, softer, open in a way she'd never seen. So have you, she said quietly. You could have left us all to die. Instead, you stayed and helped build something worth protecting. I stayed because of you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Clara felt her heart do something complicated. Rhett, I'm not saying this to make things awkward. I just want you to know. He set down his soup and looked at her directly. You're the first person in 10 years who made me believe I could be more than the man the war turned me into. You made me want to stay instead of run. And I don't know what that means or where it goes, but I wanted to say it. Clara didn't know how to respond. Didn't know if she should. So she just reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a while, watching the stars come out over the valley they'd fought so hard to keep. Winter dragged on with the cruel patience of something that knew it had already won. But the people in the valley kept fighting anyway. They rationed carefully, hunted when they could, helped each other through sickness and cold, and the moments when despair threatened to crush them all. Clara organized work crews. Rourke handled logistics. Garrett surprised everyone by becoming the voice of experience, teaching newcomers how to survive in country that killed the unprepared. And Rhett stayed beside Clara through all of it, steady and solid, and refusing to let her carry everything alone. Dalton kept his word. He sent supplies twice more during the winter, not charity, but the beginnings of a partnership. His sons even helped repair the barn roof after another storm damaged it. Slowly, grudgingly, the community took shape. February brought a thaw. Not spring yet, but a break in the brutal cold. People ventured outside, blinking in the sunlight like animals emerging from hibernation. The snow began to melt. Water ran in streams down the mountainsides. And one morning, Clara woke to the sound of birds. She stepped outside and stared. Green, actual green, pushing through the snow, tiny shoots of grass. The first sign that winter was ending. People gathered outside, pointing, laughing, some of them crying. They'd made it. Not all of them. They'd lost 3 people over the winter, but most of them. Against odds that should have killed them all, they'd survived. That night they held a gathering. Not quite a celebration, they were all too exhausted for that, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of what they'd accomplished together. Rourke stood and raised his cup. To the people who refused to quit, everyone drank. Then Garrett stood, leaning on a cane he'd carved himself. To Clara Whitmore, who saved us all by being too stubborn to let us die. Clara felt her face burn as everyone turned to look at her. She wanted to deflect, to say it wasn't just her, that everyone had contributed. But Rhett squeezed her hand under the table and whispered, "Let them thank you." So she did. She stood, raised her own cup, and said simply, "To survival, and to whatever comes next." They drank to that. Spring came fully in late March. The snow melted into streams that rushed through the valley. Green spread across the land like a promise. Animals returned. The world that had tried so hard to kill them slowly came back to life. People began rebuilding, not just repairing what winter had damaged, but actually building. New cabins, better barns, gardens planted in soil that hadn't seen cultivation in years. Dalton's family joined them, not as conquerors, but as partners. His sons worked alongside Samuel and the other men. Margaret taught the women how to preserve food for the next winter. The boundaries they'd fought over became meaningless as everyone focused on the work ahead. Clara walked the property one afternoon with Rhett, looking at everything they'd built. The cabin had been expanded, still rough but livable. The barn stood solid, fences marked clear boundaries, gardens waited for seeds. "It's not much," she said. "It's everything," Rhett corrected. 6 months ago, this was a dying homestead with one sick man and a collapsed barn. Now it's the center of a community. Clara looked at the people working. At Samuel teaching Daniel how to plant, at Martha hanging laundry. At Garrett, stronger now, healthier, arguing with Dalton about the best place to dig a well. "We did this," she said softly. "You did this. We just followed." Clara turned to face him. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." Rhett smiled. "I know." She laughed and pushed him lightly. He caught her hand and held it. "Clara, I need to tell you something." Her heart started beating faster. "What?" "I'm staying, for good, if you'll have me." "Rhett, I know I'm not much. War broke something in me I don't think will ever fully heal. But being here, working beside you, helping build something real, it's the first time in years I felt like I have a purpose." He looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, from something bigger, something she'd stopped believing she'd ever feel. Being wanted. "I'd like that," she whispered. Rhett smiled, a real smile, wide and genuine, and pulled her into a hug that felt like coming home. By summer, the valley had transformed completely. 7 new cabins stood scattered across the property. Gardens burst with vegetables. The barn housed 6 horses, 2 cows, and a dozen chickens someone had brought from town. Children played in the stream. Women worked together on projects that benefited everyone. Men cleared land and built fences and argued good-naturedly about the best way to do everything. Clara and Rhett got married in June. It wasn't fancy. No church, no priest, no formal ceremony, just Rourke reading words from a book while everyone gathered around. Clara wore a dress Margaret had helped her sew. Rhett wore clean clothes and his best attempt at a smile. Garrett stood beside Rhett, and Samuel stood beside Clara. And when Rourke asked if anyone objected, Daniel shouted, "No!" So enthusiastically, everyone laughed. They kissed, people cheered, and Clara felt something she'd never expected to feel, complete. That night, lying beside Rhett in the cabin they'd built together, Clara thought about the girl who'd stepped off the train 6 months ago. Alone. Unwanted. Desperate. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that survival required more than just refusing to die. It required building something worth living for. It required asking for help. It required seeing people, even enemies, as potential allies instead of permanent threats. It required choosing to fight not from desperation, but from hope. "You awake?" Rhett whispered. "Yeah." "What are you thinking about?" Clara smiled in the darkness. "How far we've come." "We've come far." Rhett pulled her closer. "But we've got further to go." "I know." "Good." He kissed her forehead. "Because I'm not done building yet." Neither was Clara. By the following spring, the settlement had a name: Whitmore Valley. Clara had tried to argue for something else, but everyone voted, and the decision was made. Her name, her valley, her legacy. More families arrived as word spread about the community that had survived the brutal winter. They came from all over, Wyoming, Colorado, even as far as Kansas. People looking for a fresh start, for a place where cooperation mattered more than competition. Clara welcomed them all, but she set rules. Everyone worked, everyone contributed, everyone got a say in major decisions. And anyone who tried to take more than their share or bully others got one warning before being asked to leave. It worked because people wanted it to work. Because they'd learned the same lesson Clara had, that survival alone wasn't enough. You needed purpose, community, something bigger than yourself. Garrett eventually signed over his entire claim to Clara and Rhett, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He stayed in the valley, helped run things, became something like a grandfather to the children who'd arrived. He never talked about his son again, but sometimes Clara caught him watching Daniel play, and she saw something like peace in his eyes. Samuel remarried a widow named Anne who'd arrived in the second wave of settlers. They built a cabin near the stream and raised Emma and Daniel alongside Anne's 2 daughters. The children who'd almost died in the snow grew up strong and healthy, with no memory of the trauma that had nearly ended them. Dalton and his family integrated fully into the community. His sons married girls from the valley. Margaret became Clara's closest friend, and Dalton himself, the man who'd threatened to burn everything down, became one of the community's strongest advocates. People were complicated. That was the truth Clara learned. No one was entirely good or entirely evil. Everyone carried pain. Everyone made mistakes. And sometimes the difference between an enemy and an ally was just the willingness to try. 2 years after Clara arrived, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Sarah after Samuel's wife, the woman who died in the snow protecting her children, the woman whose sacrifice had led to Clara saving the baby and starting the chain of events that built this entire community. Rhett held his daughter and cried. Clara had never seen him cry before, not during the storms, not during the fights, not even at their wedding, but he cried holding Sarah, and Clara understood why. Because this was proof that they'd done more than just survive. They'd built a future. The valley continued to grow. By year 5, it had a school, a church for those who wanted it, a trading post, a town hall where people gathered to vote on everything from water rights to boundary disputes. Clara ran most of it, though she tried to delegate as much as possible. She'd learned that leadership wasn't about control. It was about empowering others to contribute, about recognizing that everyone had something valuable to offer. Rhett worked beside her always, steady and solid. He never tried to take over, never questioned her decisions in public, never made her feel like she needed permission to lead. But in private, he was her advisor, her sounding board, her partner in every sense of the word. They had 2 more children, a son named William, after Rourke, and another daughter named Margaret, after Dalton's wife. Clara watched them grow up in the valley she'd fought to build, and she felt something close to satisfaction. Not perfection. Life was still hard. People still fought sometimes. Winters were still brutal. Loss still happened. But it was life. Real life. Messy and complicated and worth living. One evening, 10 years after she'd arrived, Clara stood on the porch of the house they'd built. A real house now, with multiple rooms and glass windows and a stone chimney that didn't smoke up the interior. Behind her, she heard her children laughing. Rhett was teaching William how to whittle. Sarah was reading to Margaret from a book the traveling merchant had brought. Around the valley, lights appeared in cabin windows as families settled in for the night. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere, a dog barked. Someone played a fiddle badly, but enthusiastically. It was home. Rhett came out and stood beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Clara leaned into him. "About the girl who got off the train with nothing but a carpet bag and a stupid letter. That girl was brave. That girl was desperate. Same thing sometimes." Rhett kissed her temple. "You proud of what we built?" Clara looked out at the valley, at the community that had risen from nothing, at the proof that stubbornness and hope and the refusal to quit could actually change the world. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I am." "Good. Because tomorrow we've got to mediate that fence dispute between the Johnsons and the Pratts." Clara groaned. "Can't we have one day without drama? Where would be the fun in that?" She laughed and turned to kiss him properly. Behind them, their children made gagging noises. Clara broke away and chased them inside, their shrieks of laughter filling the house. And standing on that porch, watching his family disappear inside, Rhett thought about the day he'd ridden into Bitter Creek to deliver bad news to a mail-order bride. He'd expected to find some desperate, helpless girl who'd be easy to send back east. Instead, he'd found Clara. And she'd saved his life just as much as he'd saved hers. Maybe more. The years continued to pass, as years always do. Clara grew older. Gray appeared in her hair. Lines formed around her eyes. Her hands, once soft from city living, became permanently calloused from work. But she never stopped building, never stopped fighting for the community she'd created, never stopped believing that people were worth saving, even when they didn't believe it themselves. She became legendary in the territory, the woman who'd arrived with nothing and built something from sheer will. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away just to see Whitmore Valley, to understand how she'd done it. And Clara always told them the same thing. "I didn't do it alone. No one survives alone. We did it together. And that's the only way anything worth building ever gets built." Some listened, some didn't. But enough did that other communities started following her model. Cooperation instead of competition. Voting instead of violence. The radical idea that helping your neighbor made you stronger instead of weaker. It wasn't perfect. It didn't solve everything. But it was better than what came before. And that was enough. Clara Whitmore died in her sleep at 73, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren she never imagined she'd have. Rhett followed her 6 months later. Some said it was a heart attack. Others said it was grief. But everyone agreed that it was fitting. They'd built their life together, so it made sense they'd leave it together too. They were buried on a hill overlooking the valley, under a stone that read simply, "Clara and Rhett Mercer." They refused to quit. The settlement continued long after they were gone. It became a town, then a city. The valley they'd fought to keep became home to thousands. And every time someone new arrived, lost, desperate, afraid, someone always told them the story of the mail-order bride who stepped off a train into the middle of nowhere and decided to stay. Who built a community from nothing but stubbornness and hope. Who proved that being unwanted didn't mean being worthless. Who showed everyone that sometimes the people the world throws away are exactly the ones who change it. Daniel, Samuel's son, lived to be 91. Before he died, he told his great-grandchildren about the woman who'd breathed life back into him when he was buried in the snow, who'd given his family a home when they had nothing, who'd taught him that survival was about more than just refusing to die. "She saved my life," he said. "But more than that, she gave it meaning." That was Clara's real legacy. Not the buildings or the land or even the community. It was the lesson she'd proven with her life. That no one is born worthless. That value isn't something given by others. It's something you claim for yourself. That being wanted isn't about waiting for someone to choose you. It's about choosing yourself. And then building something so undeniable, so real, so worth protecting that everyone around you has no choice but to recognize it. Clara Whitmore arrived in Wyoming Territory with nothing. She left behind everything. Not because she was perfect. Not because she never made mistakes. Not because survival was easy or clean or anything like the stories people tell. But because she refused to surrender. Refused to believe that being abandoned meant being finished. Refused to let fear or cold or any enemies or even winter itself decide her worth. She decided it herself. And that decision changed everything.